Sometime in the late 1880s, on a wide stretch of open heathland in the northeast of the Netherlands, a family began digging as the sun went down. They owned no land and had no money to rent any. What they did have was a spade, some branches, and a piece of common ground that officially belonged to no one. They dug a shallow pit, propped up a simple frame of branches, and covered it with slabs of turf cut from the heath, layered like roof tiles. Subscribe and comment for more medieval videos. By sunrise, there was a low doorway, a knee-high roof, and smoke drifting from the front wall. That smoke was everything. In the peat districts, the poorest families followed an unwritten custom: build a shelter between dusk and dawn, get a fire going by morning, and the community would accept it. Once someone lived there, it stopped being empty heath and became a home. The Dutch called these dwellings Plaggenhutten, sod huts, named after the Plaggen, the turf blocks used for walls and roof. By 1900, tens of thousands of the country's poorest people were living in them across Drenthe, Overijssel, and the peat areas of Groningen. How did the lowest rung of society end up in a house style that Frisian farmers had already perfected 1,000 years earlier? Because this story doesn't truly begin in the 19th century, it goes back much further, to a fundamental problem that had no easy answer. How do you build a house in a land with almost no stone, very little good timber, scarce clay, and poor sandy soil? The northern Netherlands, northwest Germany, and the Frisian coast ranked among the most difficult building environments in Europe. There were no quarries. Forests were thin and kept shrinking as people cleared them for fuel and farmland. Along the coast, before the Great Dikes, the land flooded regularly, and trees barely grew at all. If you wanted shelter from rain and wind for your family and animals, you had only one material in unlimited supply: the earth itself. So they built with grass, soil, and roots, cut into blocks and stacked. We know how seriously this tradition mattered because archaeologists have spent years reconstructing one. In the Frisian village of Ferdgum, a team from the University of Groningen rebuilt an early medieval sod house based on the excavated floor plan of a farm at Leens in Groningen, dated around the year 700. Archaeologist Daniel Postma led the project, turning it into a doctoral thesis and a book whose title captures 1,000 years of history at a glance. The Sod House in the Frisian coastal region, between 400 and 1300. For nearly 1,000 years, the typical farmhouse in this part of Europe had walls made entirely of stacked turf blocks. These were not wooden frames filled with sod. The sod walls themselves carried the roof. People literally grew their houses from the fields. The modern reconstruction revealed just how skilled the original builders were. When Postma's team completed their first version in June 2013, it stood for less than 6 months. One stormy night in late November, after heavy rain, a large section collapsed. Water had seeped into the turf walls, adding weight they couldn't support. The team rebuilt it with improvements, and it has stood firmly since 2015. That failure taught today's builders what medieval people knew from experience. The greatest strength of a sod house and its fatal weakness were the same: water. The sod house solved the immediate need for shelter, but a bigger long-term problem remained. The same poor sandy soil that offered nothing for building also produced almost nothing to eat. The solution they developed is one of the most underrated engineering achievements in European history, precisely because it is almost invisible. Every year, farmers went out onto the heath and cut the top layer of heather, grass, and soil into slabs. They carried these back and used them as bedding in cattle stalls and sheep pens. Throughout the winter, the animals soaked the turf with manure and urine. In spring, they dug out the enriched, nitrogen-rich material and spread it on the fields near the village. They repeated this cycle year after year for 8 to 10 centuries. Over time, the fields slowly rose. While normal arable soil is usually about 30 centimeters deep, these man-made fields reached depths of 40 centimeters, 80 centimeters, and in some places more than 1.5 meters. The Dutch call them Eisen or ink, the Germans Plaggen, and soil scientists refer to them as Plaggenanthrasols, soils literally manufactured by human hands. In the Netherlands alone, more than 221,000 hectares of this artificial soil exist with layers thicker than 50 centimeters. This practice expanded during the early Middle Ages and continued almost unbroken until artificial fertilizers arrived around 1900, making it obsolete almost overnight. If you drive through the sandy eastern Netherlands and see a field sitting noticeably higher than the surrounding land with a sharp drop at its edge, you are not looking at a natural hill. You are looking at 1,000 years of cut heath, animal manure, and human labor stacked winter after winter by people whose names have been forgotten. The usual version of this story stops at the noble image of peasants building up fertile soil. It leaves out the cost. All that good earth had to come from somewhere, and it came from the heath. Year after year of cutting turf stripped the living skin from the land, creating vast, exhausted landscapes of bare sand and heather. And it was on these worn-out, half-abandoned commons that the poorest people ended up living. By the 19th century, while the old medieval farms with their deep, dark, hand-built soils continued to function, a new population appeared in the peat bogs, drawn by brown gold, dried peat, an excellent fuel. As Dutch cities and industries grew, demand soared. Cutting peat was harsh, seasonal, poorly paid work that attracted thousands of desperate and unemployed people from across the country to the bogs of Drenthe and Groningen. Peat companies wanted labor close by. Workers needed somewhere to live. So the ancient sod building tradition returned in its most stripped-down form. A Plaggenhut was no longer a proper farmhouse. It was barely a building. You dug a pit about 50 centimeters deep into the peat or sand, leveled the floor, added a rough frame of branches or trunks, and covered it with heath turfs layered like shingles. The whole structure often rose only slightly above the ground, like a long, low mound. The front gable might have a door and one small window. Inside, people sometimes lined the dirt walls with newspaper or cardboard. Families of 6 to 9 people slept in 1 or 2 box beds built into the wall, often sharing the space with a sheep or goat, their only real wealth and a source of free warmth. Life inside was tough. The huts were damp, hard to heat properly, and infested with vermin. Winters were the harshest test. Seasonal work meant hunger and cold arrived together, and a single small fire had to warm a large family through freezing nights, while the walls wept moisture. One of the last known inhabitants was Fenicienne Wakens. She lived in a genuine Plaggenhut in a settlement so poor it was simply called the Hut District, near Tang in Groningen. Photographs from around 1935 show her, an elderly woman, standing in the doorway of a turf mound. She remained there until her death in 1941. The last true Plaggenhut in Drenthe was demolished in 1949. Think about that. There are people alive today whose grandparents were born in houses made of stacked grass, using a building method that was already ancient when the Vikings raided Ireland. This is not distant history. It ended within living memory. Beyond the hardship, these simple huts contained surprisingly modern ideas. The thick blanket of earth that made them damp also made them survivable. Soil is an excellent insulator and thermal mass. A structure dug into the ground and wrapped in turf barely feels the difference between a freezing night and a hot day. This is the same principle behind modern earth-sheltered homes and green roofs that help cities reduce heating and cooling costs. They were also a perfect example of true sustainability, built entirely from local materials by hand, with no transport, no factories, and no waste. When abandoned, they simply returned to the heath. The deep, dark Plaggen soils they created are among the most carbon-rich agricultural soils in Northwest Europe. What medieval peasants did out of necessity, steadily adding organic matter year after year, is exactly what today's scientists are trying to replicate to sequester carbon and restore depleted soils. You can still see reconstructions today at the Netherlands Open Air Museum in Arnhem, the Ellert and Brammert Museum, and other heritage sites. You can stand in a doorway and touch a wall made of grass, connecting directly to a 1,000-year-old tradition. That family digging at dusk and lighting their fire wasn't just trying to survive one more night. They were performing the final act of a building tradition that had lasted a millennium. People with no army, no stone, no timber, and no legal land turned the ground beneath their feet into a home. Every morning, the rising smoke proved they had succeeded. We dig up forgotten knowledge, not because the old ways were always better, but because some of them solved problems we are now spending fortunes to solve again.